lot of these voters found themselves voting for right-wing populist parties. So, the story of the decline of the left is a complicated one, but I think the 90s are really kind of a hinge decade because they really changed the profile of the left, what the left was seen as standing for, and how many voters therefore viewed what it meant to be on the left, right? Up through that point, really left meant an economic left. After the 1990s, the left didn't look that different economically from center-right parties, Christian democratic parties, conservative parties, and it became increasingly associated with non-economic issues, which was just not able to sustain it as much electorally as its kind of traditional appeals had.
Can I ask a question in this relation? The success of the Social Democrats was based on a Keynesian political economy. But as you know, in the 70s, we lose this camp against this neoliberal. And going to the Social Democratic Party and say that you should focus more on the economic issues, they asked me, with which political economy? Should we go back to the Keynesian politic? It's not possible. So the reason that you have written in your article in Foreign Policy about the Social Democrats turn to the middle was that they couldn't continue with this kind of Keynesian political economy. What's the alternative now, according to you?
Right. So that's also really a good question, right? So one of the reasons why you have this kind of economic shift on the left in the late 20th century, in the 1990s in particular, I'm old enough to remember, I imagine many of you are sort of, the hullabaloo about, sort of third wave politics in the United States. It was called, the New Democrats or progressive neoliberalism, which is clearly not, doesn't make any sense. But again, part of the reason for that shift was that a lot of the policies and institutions that had worked very well during those post-war decades, as you said, by the end of the 20th century, they were not working very well anymore because capitalism had changed. It's a sort of, the economic system changes over time. And so things that worked well in the 1960s did not work so well in the 1980s or 1990s. And for that and other reasons, again, you sort of see a left that kind of says, okay, look, we're just going to adopt these kind of neoliberal policies because they're the kind of wave of the future. Now, I think from 2025, we can see that neoliberalism was not as successful as its advocates in the late 20th century said. We have societies that are characterized by still very slow growth, rising not only economic but geographic inequality in Europe, extreme forms of economic insecurity. So the promises of neoliberalism turned out to be really not fulfilled, despite the enthusiasm for them on both the center left and the right. So the question then is, sort of what's the alternative, right? So how do you create an economy in 2025 and beyond that protects citizens from these downsides of capitalism, to kind of use the older terminology, but not killing the goose that lays the golden egg, right? Without growth, without innovation, very little can get done. And, I don't think that's at all impossible, but policies clearly cannot be the same as they were in the 60s and 70s. So, for instance, again, you have to have policies that, as was traditionally the case in Sweden, that don't lock people in particular jobs. You understand that today people are going to move from job to job. You can't, as it remains the instinct in places like France and Italy, industries that are no longer viable in an advanced industrial country, these are not industries that should be protected because they are not going to be economically viable over the long term. But neither can you just say to people, look, you have been making steel or mining coal for decades, and now all of a sudden that's going to disappear, and we expect you to just kind of roll with the punches. That obviously is not viable either. You are absolutely going to get backlashes. So figuring out ways to put in place welfare state policies that help people adjust to change rather than trying to stop it, that is clearly the wave of the future, that integrate people into labor markets as opposed to simply paying them for sitting at home. Again, this is a long-standing kind of thing that was very prominent in Scandinavian countries. We have someone here from both Sweden and Norway, right? The idea that you would just simply hand out unemployment paychecks to people without any obligation to kind of continually look for a job, that is obviously not a viable long-term solution. So I think there are absolutely policies out there that are compatible with the kinds of economies we have in 2025 that are not the same as they would have been in the 60s and 70s, but still very much recognize that, you have to protect people from these negative economic consequences, but also have to help them adjust to the nature of the economy today.
Sister, do you have a question?
I have a question, yes, if you allow me. You mentioned the welfare system. I have long experience from the Norwegian welfare system. As you said before, in 20th century, the welfare system was very strong, but it didn't put any condition for their aid for people. But now this welfare system changes, get more difficult, put conditions for people who are using this welfare system. The regard to that, the right gets stronger and stronger in our countries, in Sweden, in Norway. Even now, people are angry to the system sometimes, but they are more angry to the Labour Party than to the right party, and they blame them in many things. And for me, this is very difficult to understand that why, because the situation in some way can be similar to after war, that poverty growing in these countries. But people are choosing right side. More of them, most of them. And what can be reason that even now Norway has, for example, 60% of the Norwegian population has education at the high school or university level, but they are more individualist. They are thinking about their own pocket and how much they can get. But at the same time, they believe that the right side can give them what they want. So what is the reason for that?
So, I mean, that's a great question. Let me say that more generally, part of the problem, not specifically in Norway, but I would say in a lot of other European countries, has to do with something you mentioned at the beginning, right? Which is it gets very hard to sustain support for the welfare state if people perceive, and that perception is not always true, but if people perceive that it's being abused or that government resources are, are limited, and somebody else, so to speak, is getting resources that you believe you are more entitled to. So what does that mean concretely? Part of the interaction here is, right, that you've had these kind of confluence of changes going on in Europe. And again, Norway is a kind of a special case because it remains so incredibly wealthy because of oil and its sort of after effects. But you've had this kind of perception in a lot of places that isn't entirely true, but is not also entirely false, that you have had people who have come in and used the welfare state's resources at a time when those resources are under pressure, and they're not fully participating in the labor market. And that is a very bad situation for the left to be in, right? Because that welfare state can only be sustained if people are working and if people don't feel like, some other group is getting more out of the system than they are putting in. So, I mean, part of the reason for this is that there's this confluence, as I said, between, sort of people who have come in, the changing demographics of European societies, and the sense that, the welfare state is being used to support these folks as opposed to, whatever. folks who, were born there or something like that. So, I mean, that is the kind of dynamic that the right really thrives on. And so, a kind of a smart left would say, look, the welfare state is there to support and protect everyone. But in return for that, right, you have to be constantly looking for a job. You have to, re-educate yourself for whatever jobs are out there on the market. You must pay taxes. I mean, these are not unreasonable trade-offs. And the fact that, people on the left forgot that this was part of the way that the welfare state could be sustained. That is to say, everybody had to be seen to not only benefit from it, but be contributing to it. This is the kind of situation that the left can't allow to happen because, as you said, then people look to the right when they think that government resources are going to folks who are not fully participating in the labor market or fully participating in society in other important ways.
I ask a question here about, my last question. And that's, I guess it's a interesting point you made, but I want to clarify that. These people are using quote unquote welfare state. A country like in this example of this European country, they do not consider them skilled labor because of the issue of assimilation. Truly, they can participate, but the issue is somewhere else. Because if you come to the United States, even if you are illegal, because we don't have a welfare state, people have to work. They have to work. They do a black work, and the government doesn't basically monitor them. And the issue of assimilation in the United States is not the way that Europe has. So my question here is, this welfare state is under pressure. Is it state-made pressure because they say that, okay, you come to this country, you're going to learn the language, you're going to become Swedish, Norwegian, German, whatever it is, then you can participate in the labor market the way we tell you. But considering some of the immigrants are coming from a country that are technically skilled labor, they may not know the language that well, or they could do something else. Does the society allow them to be part of labor market or not?
So that's a great question, and it varies from country to country, right? So some of it is, and I think this is what you're getting at, some of it is kind of a self-inflicted wound. So for example, take the German case, right? So in Germany, when asylum seekers or refugees come, they're not allowed to work. As you said, in the United States, the minute someone comes here, they're working in a bodega or they're working in a gas station or something like that. And that's, because you don't have a choice in the United States, right? Like you either do that or you're kind of out on the street. And sometimes you do that and you're still out on the street. But, in a lot of European countries, folks come and they're not allowed to work. And this creates a kind of vicious cycle, right? Because they don't work. And so native-born citizens become resentful of them because they think that they're just, using government resources, but they're actually not allowed to work. So some of that is kind of self-created. Some of it is also a kind of a time and consistency problem. Political scientists love fancy terminology. What do I mean by a time and consistency problem? So I have here, several what I imagine to be highly educated Iranians. Now, if you look at the data on highly educated immigrants, regardless of what their background is, they come from the Middle East, they're Muslim, they're not Muslim, they have dark skin, they have lighter skin. If they are highly educated and they come to whatever country it is, Britain, Sweden, Norway, actually, not only do they quote unquote integrate relatively quickly, but they're not actually what people are upset about. So, a good comparison, Pouyan, would be, Canada versus the United States, right? Canada, up until recently, had a very strict point system that very clearly selected for highly educated, actually fairly well-resourced immigrants. Now, I think Canada is probably a kinder, nicer place than the United States, certainly today. But, if you are disproportionately getting immigrants who come to your country with significant economic resources and significant education, and then you tout the fact that you don't have an immigration backlash, I think that's great. But, it's comparing apples and oranges, right? So why do I bring this up? Because in addition to the just the challenge of growing diversity in Europe, what you had over the past 10 years, particularly concentrated around the refugee crisis in 2015 and 16, is not only large numbers of immigrants coming, but immigrants who are coming from very low education backgrounds, places like Syria, Afghanistan. And so in addition to dealing just with a huge demographic shift, you were dealing with people who almost by definition were going to be more difficult to integrate into the labor market than, again, folks like, like the people who are here are. And that just creates a whole variety of new challenges on top of the other ones. Now, when I said time and consistency, what does this mean? Over time, we know that, even if you come to a country without a college education, without speaking the language, without many economic resources, over time, most folks do end up integrating into the labor market, and their children end up doing, even better. But the problem is that that's a long-term problem, right? Or rather, it's a longer-term process. And so for European countries that over the last 10 years, or even more since the financial crisis, have been dealing with very severe economic and financial problems, and then had this huge influx of more lower educated folks, this is just, a compounding problem that, again, has sort of created a whole variety of downstream political challenges.
Can I have an objection to this last? The question is more complicated than this, because, for example, there are a lot of studies that demonstrate that people from Afghanistan have in higher rate jobs than many other groups of immigrants now, because they accept the simplest, the hardest job that you can get. But in Sweden, for example, we have a lot of people from Poland who are working in the construction sector. And construction sector has been a very white, man-dominated sector with very high salary and status. And now they lose their status, and they hate these Polish immigrants who are getting their job. Number two, we have a lot of people with Roma origin from Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, who are coming here and are begging in the streets. So I mean, the European Union construction and the free movement of people is one of the question that is not so easy to handle. And that's my objection to the story that you told us now.
No, I think that's an important point, and it sort of circles back to some of the other questions that were asked. There's absolutely tons of racism and xenophobia in Europe and in the United States. That's a given. But as a small D Democrat, as a person who cares about democracy, who cares about human rights, what we should want to do is we should want to figure out what the heart of the problem is, so that we can deal with we can deal with it better, right? So what you point out is really crucial, right? Which is that there are a lot of people who object to immigration, but not for racist or clearly racist or xenophobic reasons, right? They object because they don't want, for instance, Poles coming into the construction industry and taking jobs at lower wages than they have gotten. That's, for example, for those of you, again, who've been living in Europe for a long time, I mean, as you well know, that up through the end of the 20th century, the left actually was not very pro-immigration. It was very concerned about immigration, not for racist or xenophobic reasons, but precisely for this reason, right, which is they were very concerned about protecting wages, about protecting unionized jobs, and they feared that letting in too many immigrants would threaten, wages and unionization, right? Now, for instance, if you look at Brexit, the backlash there was to immigrants who were coming precisely, as you said, Ali Reza, from Eastern Europe. So they were white, but they didn't like these folks coming in. They didn't like them, again, taking what they thought were their jobs, and particularly taking their jobs at lower wages, right? And if you look more generally, for people, sociologists, political scientists, who have done these kind of both statistical survey and ethnographic investigations, there are a lot of people who, when you dig down to it, their objections to immigration are not racist and xenophobic. There are a lot of those people. There are. But for a lot of people, it really focuses on these economic issues, right? I don't want these people here undercutting my wages. I don't want these people here taking away government resources at a time when budgets are strained, right? Now, those kinds of latter objections, those can be dealt with by people on the left or small d Democrats, right? Because there what you're dealing with is focusing on economic issues around which new policies, better policies can be structured, right? People who are racist or xenophobic, they're not going to want different people in their country, regardless of whether they're doctors or, people who are washing dishes, right? Those people cannot be reached by the left or by small d Democrats. But the people who are concerned about their wages, who are concerned about access to government resources, those people actually one can deal with by, again, thinking about structuring policies differently, right? So, one thing actually that I do not have a problem with in places like, and by the way, Sweden and Britain were only two of the three countries that allowed this kind of free flow of labor from Eastern Europe when these countries joined. Other countries did not allow it precisely for this reason, is saying, look, if you come here from wherever it is, Poland, the minimum wage has to be raised, right? Because if you come here, you cannot be earning less, significantly less than whatever, a native-born Swede, because that's a problem. It's a problem economically, and it's a problem socially, because it's bound to create the kind of negative dynamics that you pointed out. And so the desire should be by the left to not only raise the wages of everyone, but as you also said in your earlier comment, right, the more everyone, Afghans, anyone who comes to the country is integrated into the labor market, the better. Right now in Sweden, there's still a somewhat significant difference in labor force participation rates between immigrants and native-born Swedes, right? You want that difference to disappear, because the more that disappears, the less conflict you're going to have by people who, again, whose concerns are primarily economic, as opposed to, again, the sort of racists and xenophobes who are not going to be helped by anything, right? You want to eliminate those economic concerns, because those are the people who can be dealt with, and it's better for everyone for those kind of differences not to exist.
Thank you. I guess we can have one more question if Susan wants to ask last question.
But I will continue this discussion. You mentioned that it's not necessarily racism, but after the Ukraine war, it came a lot of people from Ukraine to Central Europe and North Europe, and they will be treated very privileged. And when we ask why, they said because they are Europeans. But people from Poland don't have the same privilege as Ukrainian people, and Syrian people, Ukrainian people. They are high educated people among them. Ukrainian people, most of them deny to work. Even they get more opportunity than other immigrants in North Europe, but they deny to work. But Syrian people or Iranian people, most of them are with high education in these countries. They don't get what they actually are qualified for. They must take very, very low paid jobs and they take it.
Right.
Because I am working in the welfare system, I have long experience. And that was something we discussed a lot in Norway. Why Ukrainian people should have privileged situation in here. We don't get any answer, and the policy was totally forced down. they believe that they are going to come in the labor market very fast and they're going to participate. It didn't happen. And for me, this is a racism. No, and I always argue in Norway that this is a racism. Why? Because they are white. They are characterized as white, and it doesn't matter which color is my skin. I am not white. I am a black in Norway. So, no matter what.
Look, I mean those are all fair points. I would say two things. One is there was obviously initially incredible sympathy, if not sort of enthusiastic embrace of refugees from Ukraine. Over time, however, you have seen in some countries, I don't know as much about Ukrainians in Norway as I do in some other places. Over time, however, you've seen similar kinds of backlashes to them, as you've seen, for instance, as Ali Reza said, to some of the other immigrants from Eastern Europe, right? Precisely for that reason, because, there was immense sympathy for them initially, maybe because they were seen as white by some people, but also because, they were seen as obviously fleeing this conflict that was right on Europe's borders. But over time, that sympathy is diminished precisely as people have begun to see them as, sort of more of a drain on resources. So you've begun to see that dynamic, despite the fact that they are quote unquote, white, which is funny because of course, as your question, I think implicitly indicates who's defined as white kind of changed over time.
Exactly.
But, as they have become more of a sort or seen as being more of an economic burden, that enthusiasm has waned. And again, I don't know as much about Ukrainians in Norway, but that's certainly true in other European countries, including Germany, for example, where there are obviously a lot of Ukrainians. The other thing is, and this is a totally different issue, is the question of kind of what exactly refugee status means. I mean, for the Ukrainians, the initial hope, which turned out unfortunately not to be true, is that these were folks who were coming and then they were going to go back pretty quickly, right? Like this was, there was a war, it was going to last for, whatever, a year or two, and then the Ukrainians were absolutely going to go back. That assumption is not really true, or wasn't true, initially with a lot of the folks who came from other places. And that also created somewhat different dynamics. Again, I don't know as much about the Norwegian welfare system in other places where, there was a difference between dealing with people who you thought were sort of, kind of long-term visitors, but were absolutely going back to their country, as opposed to people who you were like, look, they're here. We don't know if they're ever going back. So those also created somewhat different dynamics, not just among the way welfare states dealt with them, but also I think the way citizens viewed them. Again, the longer they were there and seen as not fully participating, the more problematic they became.
Yeah, exactly. It's true.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the time Professor gave us. And we tried to publish this podcast quickly. And thank you very much.
And thank you, Puyan. Thank you very much, Joey, for sharing your time with us. I have read a lot of your books, and it was an opportunity to see you live.
Yeah, I started to read your works, Professor Bermud, because I didn't know you before I met Puyan, and now I follow you, and I enjoy it really. Very, very good work. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
Thank you very much. شب بخیر.
مرسی پویان، مرسی.
مرسی.